I handed over the invitation. The guest before me took 30 seconds. When it was my turn, the attendant paused longer. She checked the name again. Then the date. Then the envelope edge. "One moment," she said. She stepped aside. Another guest walked past us. No pause. No second look. He was waved through. I waited. The attendant returned. "You're good," she said. She handed me a wristband. Gray. She didn't explain it. I stepped inside. The hall was already full. White chairs. Soft lighting. A low hum of voices. The ceremony hadn't started. People stood in loose circles. I walked forward. Two people stopped talking. They shifted. A small gap formed. Not wide. Just enough. I kept moving. I looked for a seat. There were empty ones. None were offered. I chose one near the technical table. Black cables ran under it. A speaker hummed softly. I sat. No one sat beside me. A man passed and looked at my wristband. Then away. A woman glanced at the chair next to me. She turned back to her group. "Is this taken?" Someone asked behind me. "I think so," another voice answered. I didn't turn around. I stayed seated. I watched the pattern. Groups tightened. Circles closed. The aisle stayed clear. An usher walked by. He checked a clipboard. He didn't look up. A server passed carrying a tray of water glasses. She stopped at a table. Poured. Moved on. She passed me. No pause. I waited. She didn't come back. I stood and walked toward the refreshment station. Glass pitchers. Water. Lemonade. Coffee urns. I waited at the edge. A server approached another guest. "Water?" she asked. "Yes," the guest said. She poured. I raised my hand slightly. "Excuse me," I said. The server looked at me. She nodded once. "Let me double check," she said. She turned away. She didn't return. I waited. Two other guests arrived after me. They were served. I stepped back. I didn't say anything. I walked toward the restrooms. There was a short line. I stood at the end. A man arrived behind me. Another man gestured him forward. "Go ahead," he said. The man stepped past me. No one looked at me. The line moved. I stayed. My shoulders tightened. Just a little. I'd felt this before. I checked my phone. No new messages. I typed one. "I'm inside." The reply came quickly. "Noted. Stay put." I put the phone away. I returned to my seat. The chair beside me stayed empty. The ceremony music started softly. People took their places. The aisle is filled. The bride hadn't entered yet. A woman approached me. She stood close enough to lower her voice. "You're with which side?" she asked. "I'm listed," I said. She smiled briefly. "Family or friends?" she asked. "Listed guest," I said. She nodded. She didn't move. She waited. "This section is usually full," she said. "It will be," I said. She stepped back. She looked around. She walked away. I watched her rejoin a group. They leaned in. They looked at me. Then away. The music stopped. The doors at the back opened. Everyone stood. I stood too. The bride entered. Applause rose. Phones lifted. I stayed still. She walked down the aisle. She greeted people as she passed. She smiled. She paused at groups. She reached my row. Her eyes dropped to my wristband. Gray. She slowed. She stopped. She looked at my face. Then at the band again. Her smile faded. She looked past me. She took a step away. She continued down the aisle. I stayed standing. The ceremony continued. Vows were spoken. Laughter rose. I clapped when others clapped. I sat when they sat. When it ended, people stood again. They moved toward the aisle. I waited. The flow passed around me. No one bumped me. No one invited me forward. An usher gestured to a group. "Photos this way," he said. The group followed. I stayed seated. A man behind me whispered, "Who is that?" Another voice answered, "Not sure." The photographer passed. He adjusted his lens. He glanced at me. "Can you step aside?" he asked, trying to keep the shot tight. "Sure," I said. I stepped closer to the wall. The wall was cool. I leaned back lightly. I watched the group photo form. Arms linked, smiles widely. The photographer snapped. "Great," he said. He moved on. I returned to my seat. No one took the chair beside me. I looked at the wristband again. Gray. No mark. No words. Just color. A staff member walked by with a tablet. She slowed. She looked at me. She looked at the screen. The screen froze for a second, then refreshed. She kept walking. The wristband stayed gray. I stayed seated. The chair beside me stayed empty. People stood, shifted, found each other. I waited for the aisle to clear. It didn't. The flow bent around my row. Not sharp, smooth. An usher passed again. Clipboard tucked to his chest. He slowed. Looked at the seat numbers. Skipped mine. Kept going. "Excuse me," I said. He stopped this time. "Yes? Is there a seating map?" I asked. He glanced down. "We're pretty full," he said. "I'm listed," I said. He nodded. "I'll check," he said. He didn't write anything. He stepped away. I watched him stop at another row. Lean in. Whisper. A couple stood, smiled, took photos. I stayed. A staff member approached with a cart of programs. She placed them on her lap. On by one. She reached my row. She handed one to the person across the aisle. Skipped me. Kept moving. "Program?" I asked. She stopped. "Oh," she said. She looked at my wristband. "Gray?" She looked at the cart. "I'll bring one back," she said. She turned the corner. She didn't return. The music shifted to a softer loop. Chairs scraped lightly. People settled. The officiant adjusted the microphone. I folded my hands. My phone buzzed. One notification. I didn't open it. A man 2 seats down leaned toward his partner. "Is he with the venue?" he whispered. "I don't think so," she said. They both looked forward. The officiant spoke. Heads nodded. People nodded. I nodded when others nodded. When the officiant paused, a staff member crossed the aisle, carrying a sign. "Reserved." It read. He placed it on 2 seats in the front. The sign faced the room. Clean. Clear. I noticed there was no sign on my row. Still. No one sat. The ceremony ended. Applause rose. People stood. The aisle filled fast. A photographer waved a hand. "Family first," he said. "Friends next." Groups separated. The front rows moved. The middle followed. My row stayed still. "Friends. This way." The photographer called again. I stood. I waited for eye contact. No one came. "Sir," the photographer said, finally noticing me. "We'll get you in later." "When?" I asked. He checked his camera. "After family," he said. "I'm listed," I said. He nodded. "Later," he repeated. He turned away. I stepped back. The wall was still cool. I leaned again. People arranged themselves. Arms linked. Laughter. Phones up? I watched the frame tighten without me. A staff member with a tablet stopped near my row. She tapped. The screen spun. She tapped again. "Is there a problem?" I asked. She looked up. "No," she said. "Just syncing." "With what?" I asked. She hesitated. "The list," she said. She angled the tablet away. The spinner kept turning. "Can I see the list?" I asked. She shook her head slightly. "I can't share that," she said. Who can? I asked. She looked toward the front. Event manager, she said. I can call her. I said. She nodded. I'll let her know, she said. She typed. The spinner stopped, then started again. She stepped away. People began moving toward the reception area. Tables filled. Place settings waited. Name cards caught the light. I walked slowly. I found my table. My name was there. Printed. Centered. I touched the card. It didn't move. I sat. The chair across from me was empty. The chair beside me was empty. A server passed with a tray of water. She stopped at my table. She poured. Didn't look up. She moved on. Excuse me, I said. She stopped. Water, she asked. Please, I said. She poured. She didn't say anything else. Thank you, I said. She nodded once. A man at the next table leaned over. Are you waiting for someone? He asked. No, I said. He nodded. He turned back. The event manager appeared near the head table. She scanned the room. Her eyes moved table to table. She paused when she reached mine. She walked closer. Hi, she said. I'm checking on seating. I asked for the list, I said. She smiled briefly. Everything looks fine, she said. My name is here, I said. I touched the card again. She looked down. Yes, she said. Then why hasn't anyone joined me? I asked. She didn't answer. She adjusted her headset. It buzzed. We're on schedule, she said. I'm not asking about timing, I said. She nodded. Right, she said. She tapped her tablet. Can you show me the wristband guide? I asked. Her fingers stopped. The what? She said. The colors. I said. What do they mean? She glanced at my wrist. Gray. She looked around. It's just for tracking, she said. Tracking? I asked. She pressed her lips together. Flow, she said. My phone buzzed again. I opened it this time. One line. Keep observing. I put the phone down. The system kept moving, just not toward me. I stayed seated. The chair beside me stayed empty. Plates arrived. Cutlery aligned. Napkins folded once. The room moved forward without me. Then slowed. The event manager crossed again. Faster now. Tablet tight to her chest. She stopped at my table. Not beside me. Across. She tapped. The screen didn't spin. It opened. Her jaw tightened. She looked at my wrist. Gray. She swallowed. One moment, she said. She didn't wait for an answer. She walked straight to the head table. Chairs shifted there. Not casually. Deliberate. A coordinator leaned in. Whispered. Another nodded. The photographer lowered his camera and checked his settings without shooting. A server returned with water. She set the glass in front of me first this time. Centered. Hands steady. Anything else? She asked. No, I said. She nodded and stayed close, pretending to adjust the tray. The bride moved through the room. Her smile was smaller now. Measured. She greeted a table. Then another. She reached my row and stopped. She looked at my face. Then the wristband. Gray. She said my name clearly. Not as a question. Marcus Reed. Conversations thinned. Chairs stilled. A few heads turned and stayed turned. Yes, I said. She nodded once, stepped aside, and looked to the event manager. The manager returned with the tablet held out, angled for both of us. The bride glanced at the screen, then back at me. You're listed, she said. I am, I said. She exhaled through her nose. A signal passed. The coordinator lifted a headset, spoke softly. A staff member walked to the aisle and turned a sign. The word faced the other direction now. Paths opened. A chair scraped beside me. Someone sat, not close, not far. Sorry, he said. I didn't realize. It's fine, I said. The photographer raised his camera. One more, he said, and pointed to my row. Here, I stood. The group made space without being asked. Arms adjusted. The frame widened. The camera clicked. He nodded and moved on. The room didn't applaud. It didn't need to. The event manager stayed near me. Not watching the tablet now. Watching the room. A server brought bread and set it down at my place first. Then the others. The person beside me leaned back. You work with the venue? He asked. I oversee compliance, I said. He paused. For tonight? For patterns? I said. He nodded once and looked forward. The event manager returned again. Everything okay here? She asked. It is, I said. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. We had previous complaints, she said. We're addressing them. I know, I said. Her tablet buzzed. She looked at it. Then at the head table. We'll need statements, she said. From staff? I said. And timelines. She nodded. Already started. Across the room, Linda Carter stood and spoke to a coordinator. Her voice stayed low. Her hands moved more than before. A security lead approached her and pointed toward a side hallway. She stopped, adjusted her clutch, then followed. No scene, no raised voices, just movement. The bride watched, then looked away and continued greeting guests. The room found a new rhythm. Chairs filled, conversations resumed. Not the same, tighter, more careful. My phone buzzed. I didn't look right away. A minute passed. Then another. I opened it. One message. Escalation approved. I typed back one word. Noted. I stood. The event manager noticed immediately. Do you need anything? She asked. I need the incident log, I said. She nodded and handed me the tablet. I scrolled. Time stamps. Names. Color codes? Gray appeared more than once. I handed it back. Preserve this, I said. Do not edit. She nodded. Security footage, I asked. Saved, she said. Guest statements. Being collected. I looked toward the side hallway. The security lead returned alone and handed the event manager a badge. She placed it in her pocket. The head table shifted again. A chair was removed quietly. Not replaced? People noticed. They pretended not to. The person beside me whispered, Is someone in trouble? A process. Is. I said. He didn't ask more. Later, as plates cleared, the event manager approached one last time. We'll issue a corrective notice to the venue staff, she said. And the family, I asked. She chose her words. Their sponsorship status is under review, she said. Effective immediately. I nodded. That was enough. I sat again. The wristband stayed gray. No one touched it. No one asked to remove it. When people began to leave, I stayed a moment longer. I watched how they moved now, who they made room for, where they paused, which paths stayed open. I stood and walked toward the exit. The security lead held the door. Thank you, he said. You're welcome, I said. Outside. The night air was cool. My phone buzzed again. Case file opened. It read, Follow-up scheduled. I typed back one word, complete. If you recognize this shift, you already know what it means. Black CEO Tales tracks these moments.